Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's darker corners. Tonight we're diving deep into one of the most misunderstood professions of the medieval world, the assassin. Forget everything you think you know from movies and games. The reality of being a medieval killer for hire was brutal, thankless, and absolutely nothing like the romanticized versions we see today. Before we begin this exploration together, I'd appreciate it if you could hit that like button if you enjoy these historical deep dives, and subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always amazing to see our global community come together for these late-night history sessions. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, dim those lights, and let's settle in for tonight's journey through the shadows of medieval Europe. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at assassins the same way again. Let's start by destroying the biggest myth of all, that medieval assassins were these cool, collected professionals sliding down rooftops in stylish leather gear. The truth is, if you were an assassin in medieval times, you were probably cold, hungry, paranoid, and one mistake away from a very public execution. Nobody grew up dreaming of becoming an assassin. There were no assassin schools, no master-apprentice programs, no guild halls where killers gathered to share techniques over ale. You became an assassin the same way you became a beggar or a grave robber, because life had beaten you down so far that stabbing strangers for copper coins seemed like a reasonable career choice. Most assassins were what we'd charitably call career criminals, and less charitably call desperate idiots with sharp objects. They weren't recruited by shadowy organizations or trained in secret monasteries. They were recruited in taverns, back alleys, and prison cells by people who needed someone disposable to do something horrible. The typical medieval assassin had maybe 3 qualifications. They could hold a knife without cutting themselves, they weren't immediately recognizable as nobility, and they were desperate enough to risk death for what amounted to pocket change. If you had military experience, fantastic, you knew which end of the sword was dangerous. If not, well, murder is surprisingly intuitive, but surviving afterward, that's where things got complicated. These weren't the silent, graceful killers of fiction. They were sweaty, nervous amateurs who spent more time worrying about getting caught than perfecting their craft. And frankly, most of them deserved to worry. Let's talk money, because that's ultimately what drove most people into this profession. How much do you think a medieval assassin made? Take a guess. Whatever you're thinking, cut it in half, then cut it in half again, and you might be getting close. A typical assassination contract paid between 5 and 20 silver coins, depending on the target's importance. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman made about 3 to 4 silver coins per week doing honest work. So yes, assassination paid better per job, but here's the catch. You might only get 1 or 2 jobs per year, assuming you survived them. And that's assuming you got paid at all. Many contracts were scams. You'd be promised gold, complete the job, and then find yourself hunted by the very people who hired you. Why pay an assassin when you can just kill them instead? Dead assassins don't demand payment, and they definitely don't talk to authorities. The economics got worse when you factored in expenses. Weapons cost money, disguises cost money, bribes cost money, information cost money. By the time you'd equipped yourself for a job, you'd already spent half your potential earnings. And if the job went wrong, well, you'd better hope you saved enough to flee the country, because local authorities didn't negotiate with contract killers. Some assassins tried to supplement their income with other criminal activities: theft, smuggling, protection rackets. But these often conflicted with their assassination work. It's hard to maintain a low profile when you're also known as the local muscle who shakes down merchants. The smartest assassins, and there weren't many, tried to specialize in specific types of jobs or work exclusively for certain employers. But specialization required reputation, and reputation made you memorable. In a profession where anonymity was literally life or death, being memorable was usually fatal. Hollywood loves to show assassins training in elaborate dojos, learning exotic martial arts and acrobatic techniques. The reality was far more mundane and depressing. Most medieval assassins learned their trade through trial and error, with emphasis on the error part. Your typical assassin's training consisted of, here's a knife, try not to stab yourself, the pointy end goes in the other person. That was it. No lessons in stealth, no practice with poisons, no instruction in escape routes. You learned by doing, and if you did it wrong, you died. The few assassins who did receive formal training usually had military backgrounds. Former soldiers knew how to kill efficiently and quietly. They understood tactics, terrain, and timing. But even they struggled with the transition from battlefield combat to urban assassination. Killing an armed enemy in open warfare is very different from murdering an unsuspecting target in their bedroom. Poison was considered the sophisticated assassination method, but medieval poison knowledge was primitive at best. Most assassins who tried poisoning either used doses too weak to be fatal or too strong to be subtle. Imagine trying to slip someone a deadly dose of arsenic when you don't know the difference between arsenic and flour. Many targets survived poisoning attempts, which was awkward for everyone involved. Stealth techniques were equally crude. Stealth usually meant wait until dark and hope nobody sees you. There was no understanding of patrol patterns, guard rotations, or security vulnerabilities. You just showed up, tried to get close to your target, and improvised from there. The most successful assassins weren't the most skilled. They were the luckiest. They succeeded because their targets were careless, their guards were drunk, or their timing was accidentally perfect. Skill had surprisingly little to do with it. Forget the elaborate gadgets and exotic weapons you see in movies. A medieval assassin's toolkit was depressingly basic and usually improvised from common household items. The most common assassination weapon was a simple dagger, not because it was particularly effective, but because it was cheap, concealable, and didn't require special training. Most assassins carried daggers that were essentially sharpened eating knives. They were barely adequate for cutting meat, let alone efficiently killing humans. Crossbows were popular among assassins who could afford them, but they had serious drawbacks. They were expensive, difficult to conceal, slow to reload, and made a distinctive sound when fired. Using a crossbow for assassination was like using a church bell for stealth. Technically possible, but probably not your best option. Some assassins used improvised weapons, sharpened wooden stakes, weighted clubs, even carpenter's tools repurposed for violence. These had the advantage of being innocuous until the moment they weren't, but they were also unpredictable and often ineffective. Poison, when assassins could get it, was usually basic and unreliable. Arsenic was popular but difficult to obtain and easy to detect by taste. Plant-based poisons like nightshade or hemlock were more accessible, but required knowledge most assassins didn't possess. Many poison assassinations were actually just food poisoning gone wrong. The really desperate assassins used whatever they could find. Broken pottery, sharp stones, even their bare hands. These weapons were free and always available, but using them required getting uncomfortably close to your target and usually resulted in a very messy crime scene. Most assassins couldn't afford backup weapons, so when their primary tool failed, and it often did, they had to improvise with whatever was nearby. This led to some truly bizarre assassination attempts involving fireplace pokers, wine bottles, and kitchen utensils. One of the biggest challenges facing medieval assassins was looking normal while carrying murder weapons and planning violence. This was harder than it sounds, especially when you were already a social outcast living on the margins of society. The goal was to blend in with ordinary citizens, but assassins faced a fundamental problem. Ordinary citizens didn't act like people planning to commit murder. The nervous energy, the constant vigilance, the way their eyes darted around looking for escape routes, these behaviours marked them as dangerous even when they weren't actively working. Disguises were crude and often counterproductive. An assassin might dress as a monk, but monks were supposed to be peaceful and contemplative. Hard to maintain that facade when you're sweating nervously and checking your hidden dagger every few minutes. Merchant disguises were popular, but real merchants knew about trade routes, prices, and products. Fake merchants asking suspicious questions attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention. The clothing itself was problematic. Peasant clothes were cheap, but marked you as poor and potentially desperate. Noble clothes were expensive and drew scrutiny you couldn't afford. Religious garments provided some protection, but came with behavioural expectations most assassins couldn't meet. Many assassins tried to use physical disabilities as cover, pretending to be blind, lame, or mute to explain their odd behaviour and avoid conversation. But maintaining these disguises required acting skills most assassins didn't possess. Nothing blew your cover faster than a blind man who flinched at sudden movements, or a mute who cursed when surprised. The smart assassins developed simple, sustainable personas they could maintain long term. But this required living a double life, which was psychologically exhausting and often led to mistakes. You had to remember which identity you were using, which backstory you told to whom, and which behaviours were appropriate for your current role. What kind of person becomes a professional killer? The answer is more complicated and depressing than you might expect. Medieval assassins weren't born killers or natural predators. They were usually broken people who'd been pushed past their psychological breaking point. Most assassins came from backgrounds of extreme poverty, abuse, or trauma. They'd been soldiers who couldn't readjust to civilian life, criminals who'd escalated from theft to violence, or simply desperate people who saw murder as their only viable economic option. Very few chose assassination as a first career. It was usually a last resort. The psychological toll was enormous. Unlike soldiers who killed in battle with justification and camaraderie, assassins killed alone, in secret, for money. There was no honour, no cause, no brotherhood to provide emotional support. Just you, your conscience, and a growing collection of faces that haunted your dreams. Many assassins turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with the guilt and anxiety. This created a vicious cycle. They needed money for drinks to forget their crimes, which meant taking more contracts, which created more guilt, which required more drinking. Functional alcoholism was almost universal among career assassins. The paranoia was the worst part. Every stranger might be a bounty hunter. Every knock on the door might be authorities. Every former client might have decided you knew too much. Assassins lived in constant fear, never able to truly relax or trust anyone. This isolation drove many to madness. Some assassins developed elaborate personal codes or rituals to justify their actions, only killing corrupt officials, never harming women or children, donating part of their earnings to charity. These mental constructs helped them maintain some sense of morality, but they were ultimately just sophisticated forms of self-deception. The successful assassins, the ones who survived more than a few years, usually became sociopaths by necessity. They learned to disconnect emotionally from their actions, treating murder as a purely mechanical process. This psychological armour protected them from guilt, but also cut them off from normal human relationships. The relationship between assassins and their employers was built on mutual distrust, and for good reason. Both parties were criminals engaged in conspiracy to commit murder, which made for awkward business meetings. Clients rarely met assassins directly. Instead, they used intermediaries, corrupt priests, criminal contacts, or desperate servants who could be bought or blackmailed. These middlemen added layers of protection, but also confusion. By the time instructions reached the assassin, key details were often lost or distorted. Payment was always a problem. Clients wanted to pay after the job was done, but assassins needed money up front for expenses. The usual compromise was partial payment before and the remainder after, but this satisfied nobody. Clients worried about paying for failed attempts, while assassins worried about being stiffed after successful ones. Many contracts included bizarre clauses or requirements that revealed the client's personal grudges or psychological issues. Make it look like an accident, but make sure he knows it was murder. Kill him, but don't damage the face. I want an open casket funeral. Poison him slowly over several weeks so he suffers like he made me suffer. These personal touches made jobs more complicated and dangerous. The smart clients were paranoid about leaving evidence, which made communication difficult. Messages were often vague, coded, or delivered through elaborate chains of intermediaries. Assassins frequently found themselves trying to decode cryptic instructions while planning complex murders. The red rooster crows at midnight near the baker's daughter might mean kill the tax collector Thursday night near the brothel, but it might also mean literally anything else. Professional ethics among assassins were flexible. There was an understanding that you didn't kill other assassins without good reason, and you didn't steal each other's contracts. But these rules were more like suggestions, and violations were common when money was involved. Let's get into the gritty details of how medieval assassinations actually worked. Spoiler alert, they were usually sloppy, violent, and far messier than fiction suggests. The preferred method was ambush, catching the target alone and vulnerable. But medieval life offered fewer opportunities for isolation than you might think. Nobles travelled with guards, merchants moved in groups, and even commoners were rarely completely alone. Finding the right moment required patience most assassins didn't have. Timing was critical but unpredictable. You might wait weeks for the perfect opportunity, only to have it ruined by unexpected visitors, weather changes, or your target's sudden change of plans. Many assassinations failed simply because the assassin got tired of waiting and tried to force an opportunity that wasn't there. The actual killing was usually quick and brutal. Assassins favoured multiple stab wounds to vital organs, not out of cruelty, but because single wounds were often survivable. Medical knowledge was limited, but people understood that humans were surprisingly difficult to kill efficiently. Better to overdo it than risk your target recovering and identifying you. Poison attempts were theatrical but unreliable. Even successful poisonings often took hours or days to work, during which time the target might realise what was happening and take countermeasures. Fast-acting poisons were rare and expensive. Slow-acting ones gave victims time to receive medical treatment, identify the assassin, or simply purge the poison from their system. Staged accidents were popular, but difficult to execute convincingly. Falling downstairs, drowning in shallow water, or being kicked by horses required careful setup and often left obvious evidence of foul play. Medieval people weren't stupid. They could usually tell the difference between genuine accidents and clumsy murder attempts. The aftermath was where most assassins made fatal mistakes. Leaving the scene quickly was essential, but running looked suspicious. Walking calmly away while covered in blood was also problematic. Many assassins were caught simply because they didn't have a realistic plan for the crucial minutes immediately after the murder. Medieval assassination attempts failed far more often than they succeeded, and the consequences of failure were typically fatal for the assassin. Let's explore some of the countless ways these operations went sideways. Target no-shows were surprisingly common. You'd spend weeks planning the perfect murder, position yourself at the ideal location, prepare your weapons and escape route, and then your target simply didn't appear. Maybe they were sick, maybe they changed their mind, maybe they were warned off by suspicious activity. Either way, you just wasted time and resources while exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. Wrong target incidents were horrifyingly frequent. Medieval identification was primitive. No photographs, no standardized descriptions, often not even accurate physical details. Assassins regularly killed the wrong person because they relied on vague descriptions like tall man with dark hair and a limp. Do you know how many people that could describe? Equipment failures were constant sources of anxiety. Daggers dulled or broke at crucial moments. Bowstrings snapped during the draw. Poison lost potency or was accidentally diluted. Assassins who couldn't afford quality equipment learned to expect mechanical failures at the worst possible times. Guards were unpredictably competent. Some were lazy, drunk, or easily bribed. Others were alert, skilled, and incorruptible. The problem was, you usually couldn't tell which type you were dealing with until it was too late. Many assassins died because they assumed all guards were idiots, while others failed because they overestimated security that was actually quite lax. Witnesses appeared from nowhere. Medieval buildings had thin walls, and people were naturally curious about unusual noises. What seemed like a perfectly isolated location might have hidden observers, servants, children, or nosy neighbours who saw everything and remembered faces. Eliminating witnesses often meant creating more witnesses, leading to escalating cycles of violence. Weather was an uncontrollable variable that ruined countless plans. Rain made surfaces slippery and weapons unreliable. Snow left tracks that were easy to follow. Wind carried sounds farther than expected. Fog provided concealment, but also confusion. Sun and shadows changed throughout the day, affecting visibility and hiding spots. Medieval law enforcement's approach to assassination was inconsistent. Sometimes they pursued killers with impressive dedication and resources. Other times, they seemed almost indifferent to contract murders. The response often depended more on the victim's social status than the crime's severity. When nobles were killed, investigations could be extensive and well-funded. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and local authorities would coordinate searches, offer rewards, and pursue leads across multiple jurisdictions. They had resources, motivation, and political pressure to solve high-profile murders quickly. But when commoners were killed, the response was often perfunctory. A few questions, a cursory search of the immediate area, maybe some threats directed at known criminals. Unless someone important was personally invested in the case, investigations into ordinary murders were frequently abandoned after a few days. Medieval forensics were primitive, but not entirely useless. Investigators could identify weapon types from wound patterns, estimate time of death from body temperature, and rigor mortis, and sometimes track assassins through physical evidence like footprints or dropped items. Torture was a standard investigative tool which made captured assassins extremely dangerous to their employers. Under sufficient physical pressure, most people would confess to anything and implicate anyone. This created a powerful incentive for clients to eliminate their hired killers before they could be interrogated. Bounty hunting was often more effective than official law enforcement. Private rewards attracted experienced trackers, informants, and rival criminals who knew the assassin community. These hunters were often more motivated and better informed than official investigators. The punishment for assassination was typically death, usually by hanging or beheading. But the execution methods could be more creative for particularly notorious cases. Public torture, burning, or drawing and quartering sent clear messages about society's attitude toward contract killers. The practice of assassination varied significantly across medieval Europe, with different regions developing distinct approaches, traditions, and levels of acceptance for contract killing. In Italy, assassination was almost a fine art. The city-state's complex political rivalries created constant demand for skilled killers, and Italian assassins developed more sophisticated techniques than their counterparts elsewhere. Poison was particularly refined in Italian courts, with some families maintaining hereditary poison recipes passed down through generations. French assassins often worked within the framework of existing feudal conflicts. Rather than operating as independent contractors, they frequently served as agents for nobles engaged in ongoing disputes. This provided some legal protection. Killing your lord's enemies could be framed as military service rather than murder. English assassination was typically more straightforward and brutal. The strong central monarchy created fewer opportunities for political murder, so English assassins focused more on commercial and personal contracts. They favoured direct methods, daggers, clubs, and staged accidents rather than elaborate schemes. German assassins operated in a fragmented political landscape of competing principalities and city-states. This created opportunities, but also risks. A killer might be protected in one territory while being hunted in another. German assassins became experts at crossing borders quickly and maintaining safe houses in multiple jurisdictions. In Eastern Europe, assassination often blended with existing traditions of blood feuds and clan warfare. Killers could sometimes claim cultural justification for their actions, though this protection was unreliable and often didn't extend beyond their immediate community. Scandinavian assassins dealt with harsh weather and sparse populations that made both concealment and escape more challenging. They developed techniques suited to long winters and isolated communities, often using natural dangers like thin ice or avalanches to stage accidental deaths. Medieval assassins existed in a deeply religious society that viewed their profession through the lens of Christian morality and local superstitions. This created additional psychological burdens and practical complications for contract killers. The Catholic Church officially condemned murder in all forms, including assassination. This meant assassins were automatically excommunicated, cut off from religious community, denied sacraments, and facing eternal damnation. For people raised in medieval Christian culture, this spiritual isolation was often as painful as physical exile. However, religious condemnation wasn't always consistent. Some assassins found priests willing to provide absolution in exchange for donations or political favours. Others rationalized their actions as serving God's will by eliminating corrupt officials or heretics. These theological gymnastics provided some psychological comfort, but didn't resolve the fundamental conflict between faith and profession. Superstitions about assassins were widespread and often worked against them. People believed killers were cursed, that they brought bad luck, or that they consorted with demons. These beliefs made it difficult for assassins to find lodging, purchase supplies, or blend into communities. Some assassins embraced supernatural reputations, cultivating images as practitioners of dark magic or agents of otherworldly forces. This could provide protection. People were afraid to cross someone they believed had supernatural powers, but it also attracted attention from religious authorities eager to combat heresy and witchcraft. Religious holidays and observances created both opportunities and restrictions for assassins. Holy days, when people gathered for services, provided access to otherwise protected targets, but committing murder on religious occasions was considered especially blasphemous and often triggered more aggressive investigations. Confession was a particular problem for Christian assassins. The sacrament required sincere repentance and a commitment to avoid future sin. Assassins who confessed their crimes faced demands to abandon their profession and make restitution to victims' families, requirements that were often impossible to fulfill. Female assassins were rare in medieval Europe, but they weren't unknown. Women who entered this profession faced unique challenges and opportunities that differed significantly from their male counterparts. The primary advantage women had was invisibility. Medieval society didn't expect women to be violent criminals, which made them less suspicious in many situations. A woman could get closer to targets, especially male targets, without triggering the same defensive responses that strange men would provoke. Poison was the preferred method for female assassins, partly because it required less physical strength than stabbing or beating, and partly because women were already expected to handle food preparation and herbal remedies. A woman with knowledge of deadly plants could kill efficiently while maintaining plausible cover stories. However, women faced severe disadvantages in the assassination trade. They had fewer opportunities to acquire weapons training, less freedom of movement, and limited access to the criminal networks that provided contracts and support. Many female assassins worked through male intermediaries who took substantial portions of their earnings. Prostitutes occasionally worked as assassins, using their profession to gain intimate access to targets. This was extremely dangerous. Clients were vulnerable, but also potentially violent, and the confined spaces where such encounters occurred offered limited escape options. Noble women sometimes arranged assassinations, but rarely carried them out personally. They had resources to hire killers and political motives for murder, but their social positions made direct involvement too risky. These women operated as clients rather than practitioners. The few women who became career assassins often adopted male disguises and identities. This provided greater freedom of movement and access to weapons, but it also meant living constantly in character, a psychologically exhausting existence that many couldn't sustain long-term. The medieval assassination industry operated according to basic economic principles of supply and demand, though the market was far from efficient or transparent. Demand for assassination services fluctuated based on political instability, economic conditions, and social tensions. During periods of civil war or dynastic disputes, contracts were plentiful, but competition was fierce. During peaceful times, work was scarce, but prices were higher. The supply of assassins was relatively elastic. Desperate people could quickly enter the profession when economic conditions worsened. However, the learning curve was steep and the mortality rate was high, which limited the number of experienced practitioners available at any given time. Pricing was highly variable and often negotiated on a case-by-case basis. Factors affecting cost included the target's social status, level of protection, difficulty of access, timeline requirements, and whether the death needed to look accidental or could be obviously murder. Regional price variations were significant. Assassinations cost more in areas with effective law enforcement, stable governments, or strong social structures. They were cheaper in frontier regions, areas of political chaos, or places where violence was already common. Specialization commanded premium prices. Assassins who could reliably use poison, stage convincing accidents, or eliminate well-protected targets could charge more than those offering basic stabbing services. However, specialization also meant fewer available contracts and higher visibility within the criminal community. Payment methods varied widely. Cash was preferred but not always available. Assassins sometimes accepted goods, services, information, or protection in lieu of money. Some worked for percentage shares of inheritances or political positions their actions might create. The secondary market included services like information gathering, equipment provision, safe house rental, and disposal of evidence or bodies. These supporting industries were often more profitable and less risky than actual assassination. While there were no formal assassin schools, Certain locations and institutions served as informal training grounds for aspiring killers. Military service was the most common background for successful assassins. Former soldiers had weapons training, tactical knowledge, and experience with violence. Veterans of foreign wars were particularly valued because they brought knowledge of different fighting techniques and had fewer local connections that could compromise operations. Prisons inadvertently served as criminal universities where inmates shared knowledge about weapons, escape techniques, and professional contacts. Many assassins formed their first criminal partnerships in jail and continued collaborating after release. Certain monasteries and religious institutions, particularly those in frontier regions, attracted violent men seeking refuge or redemption. While most monks were genuinely peaceful, some institutions harboured former killers who might return to their old profession if circumstances demanded. Trading centres and port cities were natural gathering places for criminals, including assassins. The constant flow of travellers provided cover for suspicious characters, while international connections offered escape routes and foreign contracts. Mercenary companies served as both training grounds and employment agencies for potential assassins. Men who learned to kill for political causes could easily transition to killing for personal profit, and mercenary networks provided connections to potential clients throughout Europe. Criminal guilds in larger cities sometimes included assassination services among their offerings, though this was typically hidden beneath legitimate activities like protection services or debt collection. These organizations provided resources, contacts, and some degree of professional standards. Certain noble households maintained unofficial networks of agents who could be called upon for sensitive tasks. While not technically assassins, these retainers might be asked to eliminate threats to their patrons' interests. The technological limitations of medieval times severely constrained assassins' options, but necessity drove some creative solutions to technical problems. Blade weapons were the most common assassination tools, but their effectiveness varied widely based on quality and design. Cheap daggers might break at crucial moments, while well-made weapons were expensive and memorable. Many assassins used modified eating knives or common tools that wouldn't attract attention until it was too late. Crossbows offered range and stopping power, but were slow to reload and difficult to conceal. Some assassins developed collapsible or shortened versions for easier transport, though these modifications often reduced accuracy and reliability. Poison remained popular despite its unreliability. Medieval assassins experimented with various toxins, plant-based compounds, heavy metals, and even bacterial cultures from rotting meat. Delivery methods included contaminated food, poisoned weapons, and environmental hazards like tainted water sources. Mechanical devices were rare but occasionally effective. Simple spring-loaded mechanisms could deliver poison through seemingly innocent objects like jewellery or writing implements. Trap-like devices might be hidden in furniture or doorways to trigger when the target performed specific actions. Alchemical knowledge, while primitive by modern standards, provided some assassins with advantages. Understanding of chemical reactions allowed for creation of substances that could start fires, create smoke screens, or produce toxic gases in enclosed spaces. Improvised weapons were often more effective than manufactured ones because they were unexpected and untraceable. Sharpened combs, weighted purses, or modified religious artifacts could kill efficiently while maintaining perfect cover until the moment of use. Communication tools were crucial but limited. Messages were typically written in code or delivered through elaborate chains of intermediaries. Some assassins developed personal cipher systems or used predetermined signals to coordinate with accomplices. The mental health consequences of working as an assassin were severe and often led to self-destructive behaviours that compromised professional effectiveness. Guilt was the most common psychological burden. Unlike soldiers who killed in battle with social approval, assassins murdered defenseless people for money. This created intense cognitive dissonance that many couldn't resolve satisfactorily. Religious upbringing made the guilt worse by framing their actions as sins deserving eternal punishment. Paranoia was professionally necessary, but personally destructive. Assassins had to assume everyone was a potential threat. Employers might betray them, witnesses might identify them, rivals might eliminate them. This constant vigilance was exhausting and made normal relationships impossible. Sleep disorders plagued many assassins. Nightmares about victims were common, as was insomnia caused by hypervigilance. The lack of rest impaired judgment and reaction times, making mistakes more likely during subsequent operations. Substance abuse was widespread among assassins seeking to numb psychological pain. Alcohol was the most common escape, but some used medicinal herbs or other available drugs. Addiction created additional vulnerabilities and often led to careless behavior that exposed them to capture. Social isolation was both a survival necessity and a psychological burden. Assassins couldn't maintain close relationships because intimacy required trust and honesty, luxuries they couldn't afford. The resulting loneliness drove some to desperate attempts at human connection that often ended badly. Some assassins developed elaborate personal mythologies to justify their actions. They might see themselves as agents of divine will, instruments of cosmic justice, or necessary evils maintaining social balance. These rationalizations provided temporary psychological relief, but couldn't eliminate underlying guilt and trauma. Depression was common but rarely recognized or treated. Medieval understanding of mental illness was primitive, and assassins had no access to help even if they'd been willing to seek it. Many simply endured psychological suffering until it became unbearable. Despite the general grimness of the profession, some medieval assassins achieved notable success, wealth, or even legendary status within criminal circles. The most successful assassins were those who specialized in particular types of contracts or served specific clientele exclusively. By building reputations for reliability and discretion, they could command higher fees and avoid the desperate scrambling for work that characterized less established killers. Political assassins who worked for major noble houses sometimes achieved semi-official status as security specialists or problem solvers. While everyone knew what they really did, the legal fiction allowed them to operate more openly and with better protection from authorities. Some assassins transitioned into related professions like intelligence gathering, diplomatic courier work, or personal protection services. These careers used similar skills but carried less legal risk and social stigma. A few legendary assassins became folk heroes in certain circles, celebrated for audacious kills or clever escapes. These stories, probably heavily embellished, served as inspiration for aspiring killers and entertainment for criminal communities. International assassins who could work across multiple kingdoms or cultures were particularly valued. Their cultural knowledge and language skills made them suitable for sensitive diplomatic murders or cross-border operations that local killers couldn't handle. Assassins who successfully retired were rare but not unknown. The most common exit strategies involved fleeing to distant lands, entering religious life, or using accumulated wealth to establish legitimate businesses. However, the past had a way of catching up with former killers, and truly peaceful retirement was elusive. Some assassins achieved posthumous fame when their crimes were discovered years later. Archaeological evidence or historical documents occasionally revealed murders that had been successfully concealed during the perpetrator's lifetime, adding their names to the historical record of medieval crime. Several factors contributed to the gradual decline of traditional assassination practices as medieval times gave way to the early modern period. Improved law enforcement was perhaps the most significant factor. As central governments consolidated power and established more professional police forces, investigation techniques improved and coordination between jurisdictions became more effective. The old methods of simply disappearing into the crowd became less reliable. Better record-keeping made it harder for assassins to maintain false identities or escape their pasts. More detailed birth records, travel documents, and criminal files meant that suspicious individuals could be tracked more easily across regions and time periods. Technological advances in medicine made poison less reliable, as survivors were more likely to recover with proper treatment. Better understanding of toxicology also made poisoning attempts easier to detect and prove, increasing the risks for assassins who specialized in chemical methods. Social changes reduced demand for assassination services. More stable political systems provided legal alternatives to murder for resolving disputes. Growing merchant classes preferred economic warfare to physical violence when dealing with competitors. Professional armies replaced feudal militias, reducing the number of trained fighters available for civilian murder contracts. Military service became more structured and professional, making it harder for soldiers to moonlight as assassins. Religious reforms and increased literacy meant more people could read moral and legal codes for themselves, reducing tolerance for violence as a solution to problems. The concept of individual moral responsibility became more widespread and sophisticated. Economic development provided more legitimate opportunities for people who might otherwise have turned to crime. As trade and manufacturing expanded, even desperate individuals had alternatives to assassination as a survival strategy. The medieval assassination trade left lasting impacts on European culture, law, and society that extended far beyond the immediate effects of individual murders. Legal systems developed many of their modern characteristics in response to assassination threats. Laws regarding conspiracy, evidence collection, witness protection, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation all evolved partly to address the challenges posed by contract killers. Literature and popular culture were profoundly influenced by medieval assassination stories. The romanticized image of the noble assassin, the tragic hired killer, and the mysterious poisoner all originated in medieval tales that bore little resemblance to historical reality but captured public imagination. Political structures adapted to the constant threat of assassination. The development of professional bodyguard services, secure transportation methods, and official taster positions all reflected the need to protect important figures from contract killers. Criminal organizations learned lessons from medieval assassins that influenced later forms of organized crime. The importance of maintaining distance between clients and killers, using intermediaries to protect identity, and eliminating witnesses became standard practices that persisted for centuries. Security innovations driven by assassination threats included architectural changes to important buildings, development of early alarm systems, and creation of protocols for investigating suspicious deaths. Many of these innovations found applications in other areas of medieval life. The psychology of assassination became a subject of scholarly interest, contributing to early understanding of criminal behavior, moral philosophy, and the effects of violence on both perpetrators and society. Medieval theological discussions of justified killing influenced later ethical frameworks. No story of medieval assassination would be complete without examining the Hashashin, the legendary order of assassins from the Middle East, whose reputation influenced European perceptions of professional killers. The historical Hashashin were an Ismaili Shia sect based in mountain fortresses throughout Persia and Syria during the 11th and 12th centuries. Led by figures like Hassan-i Sabah, they used targeted political murders as tools of religious and political resistance against much larger Sunni powers. European crusaders encountered the Hashashin during their campaigns in the Holy Land and brought back stories that grew increasingly fantastic with each retelling. The disciplined, religiously motivated killers of reality became supernatural assassins with magical powers and unlimited dedication. The legend of the Old Man of the Mountain, who controlled assassins through drugs and promises of paradise, became one of the most persistent myths in medieval European literature. Marco Polo's account of the Hashashin's training methods, while almost certainly fictional, shaped European ideas about how professional killers were created. What made the Hashashin different from European assassins was their organizational structure and ideological motivation. They weren't desperate criminals working for money. They were religious warriors serving a cause they believed was divinely sanctioned. This gave them psychological advantages that individual European assassins lacked. The Hashashin's use of spectacular public murders was designed to maximize political impact rather than simply eliminate enemies. They understood that the psychological effect of assassination could be more powerful than the physical removal of specific individuals. Their training was systematic and thorough, emphasizing not just killing techniques, but also languages, local customs, and infiltration methods. Hashashin operatives could blend into target communities for months or years before striking, showing patience and discipline that European assassins rarely possessed. The fortress-based structure provided security and resources that individual European assassins never enjoyed. The Hashashin could plan long-term operations, maintain equipment and safe houses, and coordinate multiple simultaneous missions across vast territories. However, the Hashashin ultimately suffered the same fate as many medieval power structures. They were destroyed by the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, which showed that even the most legendary assassins were vulnerable to overwhelming conventional military force. Medieval understanding of human anatomy and physiology, while limited, did influence assassination methods and their effectiveness. Basic medical knowledge was surprisingly widespread among certain populations. Military surgeons, barber surgeons, and even some clergy had practical experience with wounds and injuries that could be applied to killing. Assassins who possessed or could access this knowledge had significant advantage. The medieval assassination trade left lasting impacts on European culture, law, and society that extended far beyond the immediate effects of individual murders. Legal systems developed many of their modern characteristics in response to assassination threats. Laws regarding conspiracy, evidence collection, witness protection, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation all evolved partly to address the challenges posed by contract killers. Literature and popular culture were profoundly influenced by medieval assassination stories. The romanticized image of the noble assassin, the tragic hired killer, and the mysterious poisoner all originated in medieval tales that bore little resemblance to historical reality but captured public imagination. Political structures adapted to the constant threat of assassination. The development of professional bodyguard services, secure transportation methods, and official taster positions all reflected the need to protect important figures from contract killers. Criminal organizations learned lessons from medieval assassins that influenced later forms of organized crime. The importance of maintaining distance between clients and killers, using intermediaries to protect identity, and eliminating witnesses became standard practices that persisted for centuries. Security innovations driven by assassination threats included architectural changes to important buildings, development of early alarm systems, and creation of protocols for investigating suspicious deaths. Many of these innovations found applications in other areas of medieval life. The psychology of assassination became a subject of scholarly interest, contributing to early understanding of criminal behavior, moral philosophy, and the effects of violence on both perpetrators and society. Medieval theological discussions of justified killing influenced later ethical frameworks. Medieval Europe's fragmented political landscape created opportunities for assassins willing to work across national and cultural boundaries. Language skills were invaluable for assassins operating in foreign territories. The ability to speak local dialects, understand cultural references, and blend into different societies made these killers much more effective than those limited to their homeland. Trade routes provided natural corridors for assassin movement and communication. Merchants, pilgrims, and other travellers could carry messages, transport weapons, or even serve as cover identities for killers moving between territories. Political refugees and exiles often became international assassins by necessity. Driven from their homelands by conflicts or persecution, they had both motivation and opportunity to work for foreign employers against their former countrymen. Religious networks, particularly among monastic orders, sometimes facilitated cross-border assassin operations. While most religious figures were genuinely peaceful, the international nature of medieval Christianity provided communication channels that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Diplomatic immunity concepts were primitive in medieval times, but ambassadors, envoys, and their retinues sometimes included assassins disguised as legitimate staff members. These killers could operate with some protection from local authorities while serving their employers' interests abroad. Marriage alliances between noble families created opportunities for assassination plots that spanned multiple kingdoms. Family feuds and inheritance disputes could motivate murders across international boundaries, requiring killers who understood multiple legal and cultural systems. Port cities and border regions were natural gathering places for international criminals, including assassins. These areas attracted people from many backgrounds and had more relaxed social controls, making them ideal bases for cross-border operations. The Crusades created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance assassination work. The movement of armies, pilgrims, and supplies between Europe and the Holy Land provided cover and motivation for killers working on an international scale. The career trajectories of medieval assassins almost always ended badly, but the specific methods of their downfall varied considerably. Death during operations was the most common end for active assassins. Combat with guards, accidents during escape attempts, and suicide rather than capture accounted for many professional killers' deaths. These operational casualties were often unnamed and unrecorded, disappearing from history as anonymously as they had lived. Capture and execution were dramatic, but relatively rare outcomes. Most assassins were killed before they could be taken alive, either by design or because they fought to the death, rather than face torture and public humiliation. Those who were captured often faced elaborate public executions designed to deter other potential killers. Betrayal by employers or associates was a frequent cause of assassin deaths. Clients who wanted to eliminate witnesses, competitors who wanted to remove rivals, or former allies who wanted to claim rewards all contributed to the high mortality rate among professional killers. Disease and injury took a significant toll on assassin populations. The stressful lifestyle, poor living conditions, and limited access to medical care made assassins vulnerable to illnesses and injuries that might not have been fatal for people living more conventional lives. Some assassins died of old age, having somehow survived long enough to retire from active killing. These rare survivors often ended their days as beggars, hermits, or criminals in other trades, usually dying in poverty and obscurity, despite their former profession's potential for wealth. Mental breakdown was another common end for assassins who couldn't cope with the psychological pressures of their profession. Some became unable to function normally and died from neglect or self-harm, while others took their own lives to escape unbearable guilt and paranoia. A few assassins successfully reinvented themselves, using their skills and knowledge to transition into legitimate occupations. Military service, private security work, or even law enforcement occasionally provided paths out of the assassination trade for those clever and lucky enough to navigate the transition. The rarest outcome was achieving legendary status that outlasted death. A handful of medieval assassins became subjects of stories, songs, and legends that preserved their memory long after their deaths, though these accounts were usually heavily romanticized and bore little resemblance to historical reality. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark world of medieval assassination, it's worth reflecting on what these historical realities teach us about human nature, society, and the complex relationship between violence and civilization. The medieval assassin's life was defined by contradictions, seeking wealth through methods that typically led to poverty, pursuing security through actions that guaranteed danger, and attempting to solve problems through techniques that usually created more problems. These contradictions reveal fundamental truths about the limitations of violence as a solution to human conflicts. Perhaps most importantly, the historical reality of medieval assassination shows us how popular culture can distort our understanding of the past. The glamorous, competent killers of fiction bear no resemblance to the desperate, often incompetent criminals who actually practiced this trade. This gap between myth and reality reminds us to question romanticized portrayals of historical violence. The social conditions that created medieval assassins still exist in various forms today: poverty, desperation, weak legal systems, and social inequality. Understanding how these factors operated in the past can help us recognize and address them in contemporary contexts. The psychological toll of violence on perpetrators was as severe in medieval times as it is today. The mental health consequences that plagued medieval assassins remind us that violence damages those who commit it, as well as those who suffer from it, making it a poor solution even for those who seem to benefit from it. Medieval assassination also demonstrates the importance of institutional structures in maintaining social order. When legal systems were weak or corrupt, people turned to private violence to resolve disputes. When law enforcement was effective and fair, the demand for assassination services declined significantly. The international nature of medieval assassination shows how criminal networks can exploit political fragmentation and weak cooperation between authorities. These lessons remain relevant for understanding modern transnational crime and the importance of international law enforcement cooperation. Finally, the ultimate failure of most medieval assassins to achieve their goals, whether personal wealth, political change, or simple survival, illustrates the self-defeating nature of violence as a problem-solving strategy. Even when assassinations succeeded tactically, they rarely produced the strategic outcomes their perpetrators or clients desired. And so we close our exploration of medieval assassination with a sobering truth. The reality was far grimmer, more desperate, and more tragic than any fictional portrayal suggests. These weren't heroes or anti-heroes. They were broken people trapped in cycles of violence that ultimately consumed them. If there's a lesson in these dark tales, perhaps it's that the problems that drove people to become assassins in medieval times, poverty, injustice, political oppression, and social inequality, are still with us today. The difference is that we now have better tools for addressing these issues without resorting to violence. The next time you see a movie or read a book featuring glamorous assassins performing impossible feats with style and confidence, remember the real medieval killers we've discussed tonight. Cold, hungry, paranoid, and almost always doomed to bad ends. The truth of history is rarely as entertaining as fiction, but it's usually more instructive. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest professions. I hope you found it enlightening, even if it wasn't particularly uplifting. Sweet dreams, and remember, the real world has always been stranger and often more tragic than anything we might imagine. If you enjoyed tonight's exploration, please like and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Leave a comment letting me know what historical topics you'd like to explore next. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful you live in an age where hiring assassins isn't a routine business expense. Good night, everyone.